The life I never saw. Quiet shape of time. I have an archive of pictures of myself asleep. A big one. Hundreds of photographs taken over the course of my life, and vehicles I barely remember, and on furniture I definitely don't. It's my personal evidence of this activity all of us humans do for at least a third of our lives. And it is so varied. I can fall asleep anywhere, and anyhow too. David Napier states that states of vulnerability often reveal more about a person's lived reality than their controlled waking moments. So Napier might have said that my sleep pattern tells us the truth about my person, that I am essentially a cat. I didn't take these photos, obviously. People around me did, usually because I looked ridiculous. Irving Goffman reminds us that everyday performances continue even in the absence of awareness. The frame simply shifts to those who witness us. That's actually exactly why I give my pre-approval. I want to reclaim being my own witness. So I say, if I fall asleep in a strange position, just take a picture. I want to see it later. I think it's hilarious. I want to see and laugh at the whens of my life that I don't get to witness firsthand. Eventually, a sense of collection emerged. Marcel Mauss would probably recognize both the somewhat contorted way I sleep and the fact that I asked to be documented as techniques of the body. Socially learned micro-rituals that organize how I inhabit my own fleshy husk. I don't think he'd use that word, but it makes it sound like a band name. Contorted husk. Gotta catch them all, even the unconscious ones. It's a curious type of consent, because I can't give it while it's happening. But because I give it ahead of time, it turns this collection of depictions of sleep into a collaborative archive, that makes this an unusual project for me. Not only because I like being behind the camera more than in front of it, but also because I'm inherently a solo creator who likes to work alone. Collaboration is an uncomfortably social concept I quite honestly tend to instinctively want to hiss at, like a cat. At least when it comes to my creative work, that is. Ariella, Aïsha, Azoulay argues that every photograph enacts a civil contract, binding photographer and subject to shared responsibility. Maybe it's also just my ego talking. Maybe I want to be able to claim all the credit. So it's slightly uncomfortable for me to use images I didn't photograph myself in a video I'm calling mine, even though I'm mostly the only person visible. Because I'm used to doing my creative work on my own, by myself, in my little introvert semi-cocoon or self-reliance. But in this project, I have to admit to relying on documentation done by others. They are the ones who capture the one part of my life I'm never aware of. Sure, it's still my project. I'm the initiator, the focus, the editor, but collaboration is uncomfortably, fundamentally built into it. Jean-Luc Nancy calls sleep a shared solitude, a state in which the self withdraws without fully vanishing. The shared aspect of Nancy's argument also fits with the inherently collaborative aspect of my occasional public sleeping and the externalization of who photographs the embodiment of my cognitively aware absence. So do I get to still call this my video? Should I even call this a video when it's filled with photographs? Really, it's just a bunch of images edited to move, with sound added. Does that automatically make it a video? If I were to categorize this precisely, I'd probably call this a slideshow with a voiceover, and during the editing process, an overplayed music track. After all, the digital moving image is nothing more than a database of stills arranged in time. That's what Lev Manovich points out. Wolfgang Ernst would say that what we are really archiving here is not just images or videos, but time itself, crystallized into retrievable technical sequences. We could debate definitions, but I'm going to go ahead and call this a video, because in the end, a video is a time-based medium. In a video, I'm more likely to say, as mentioned earlier, whereas in a written text, I'd say, see above, unless it was subtitles. Technically, in a book, it is also before rather than above, now that I think about it. I will go on a little tangent here, so bear with me. A two-dimensional text is inherently spatial, but under certain circumstances it could be temporal in its own way, just like a spoken text, especially in the context of how its creation exists before its reception. In either one, I'd be pointing out a separate event to an unseen imagined recipient, whose behavior I foretell at the time of writing, whether it's a script in preparation for reading, while recording it, for a voiceover, or a draft for the printer, or binary pixels to encode. It's still something you experience that has happened in the past, and that I'm creating for the future. There is a linearity and continuity in the act of watching a video that indicates temporality in the medium that is video, which seems, ironically, more analogous than the individual entities of pages of a book, with individual digits of letters that make up printed words. This is a point argued by plenty of theorists, but for example Willem Flusser explains it by saying that technical images reorganize our sense of temporality because they create a programmed sequence of gestures that viewers must follow. Even when skipping ahead or being kind and rewinding a video, even if images were left photographs in a slideshow style edit, it is still a sequence. Paul Ricoeur, from a different angle, insists that it is precisely through these sequences that we turn fragmented experiences into something that feels like a coherent story. My point is that while two-dimensional text is conceptually spatial, video inherently enforces duration. It has temporality, it has rhythm, it has flow, it claims time. But it sure would be prettier with you. The capsong rhyme merge here accidentally. But what does this tangent actually have to do with sleep? Here's what. A video shows movement, continuity, narrative. So does life, right? But sleep does not. Think about it. Sleep makes the mind disappear from time and then re-enter it. Sleep is discontinuous, like digitality. Regardless of what time-keeping devices tell us, we are either in a state of 1, awake, or 0, asleep. And even the nuances of combinations and variations result ultimately in compilation of categorizations. Yes, in a literal media theory reading, all three, video, slideshow, image archive, are digitality, 1 and 0. The difference is in playback structure, not in degree of digitality. But I've applied the concept of digitality to the semi-duality metaphorically. That's the difference between our experience of what a video is. Technically, continuous moving images like being awake. A slideshow video, again, moving images, but different because our eyes are tricked into believing the continuity, a combination. Or thirdly, looking at an archive of images, manually and randomly choosing, shuffling, reorganizing which static individual images to look at, like sleep. Sleep is discontinuous, like photographs. Static container moments, snapshots, isolated events. Krakauer wrote that photography tears events from their temporal context, preserving them as isolated fragments that no longer belong to a flowing narrative. While memories and associations have a temporal element, they're like fibers pulled from the larger mass of experience that is attached to, called forth by, associated with, an individual entity of a photograph. In this project, of a digital zero of experience and time. Not as a narrative, the way being conscious and a video are. Henri Bergson famously distinguished between lived duration and the spatialized fragments of memory that only imitate continuity. Isn't that so lovely? I think that's lovely. To continue my earlier point, the temporality of video rears its head again. Sleep makes the mind disappear from time and then re-enter it. And the brain then just kind of vaguely guesses what happened in between. It does a rough edit of whatever memories it can hold onto. A compilation of associations, recalls, images, and sensations. Some bits are kept, others discarded, transitions invented. For all of his faults, Freud did say that dreaming stitches disparate fragments into a pseudo-narrative, through condensation and displacement in a form of psychic montage. Editing a video with static photographs can be just like a psychic montage then, a stylistic choice, a media manifestation, and visualization of sleep and dreams. I'm telling you all this because the form of this video is deliberate. I arranged a sequence of still images following the logic of sleep. Moments are dragged and dropped into something that pretends to be continuous, even though none of it was. I'm not showing these chronologically. chronology is too optimistic for sleep. John Beatty talks about time as something created through events, not something that exists independently. His approach to time makes far more sense to me than schedules and calendars ever have. Nancy Munn similarly argues that time is produced through practices, performances, and relations, rather than ticking forward on its own. If one chooses to believe in watches and the Gregorian calendar, one could posit that I have a terrible sense of time, and adhering to these requires a lot of counterintuitive effort on my part. But with Mbiti, I understand that my innate sense of time is perfectly intact, in line with circadian rhythms, intensities of experience, and accumulations of moments. In that sense, these images are time. The photographs of time I wasn't aware of, made conscious experience, and thus my own time after the fact. Bernard Stiegler notes that techniques externalize memory into images, allowing us to experience temporalities we did not live through directly. Each image contains a moment that actually happened, a location, a sensation, a questionable fashion choice, a contortion worthy of analysis. I remember things that aren't visible, associations that are tethered to each image. What I'd been thinking while awake around the time, what I was avoiding, whether I was contentedly basking in sun rays or hoping to never wake up again, whether the place smelled like crunched leaves or sunscreen or rancid tar. The archive becomes a calendar made up of unconscious events of time, the quiet, unperformed parts of my life. Ultimately, as Merleau-Ponty might say, the sleeping body is still a body in the world. It is perceiving, dwelling, and becoming, even in its quietest hours. Thomas Xordas would also add that this body is not merely an object in culture, but the existential ground from which culture itself is lived and experienced. Sleep is also a Kulturtechnik. It's not merely a biological reset, because the way I sleep is a learned practice technique that mediates how a 2E mind structures itself in a world of minds it diverges from. Kulturtechniken are the operation through which culture shapes perception, or as Cornelia Wiesmann would put it, the verb in the sentence of media. The typical examples are reading, writing, counting, touching. But sleep can function similarly. It can be a technique for processing an excess of sensation, of thought, of associative overflow when a brain collects too much, too fast, in too many directions. Sleep becomes a technique that sorts what cannot be sorted while awake, a cultural verb, the neurological interface that allows me to remain functional. It structures time, regulates overload, reorders intensities, flushes out experienced mental sediment and the biological toxicity of being awake. Sleep is operational, like a diligent internal herding dog performing maintenance on neurological sheep. Sheep and sleep. In this sense, sleep is not the opposite of thinking, but a parallel form of it, a technique that brains like mine perform to remain inhabitable. Inside the body, there's a material, even spatial aspect to sleep. Maiken Nedergaard and Jeff Iliff discovered that being awake basically fills the brain with toxins, and deeper sleep makes the spaces between neurons widen, so cerebrospinal fluid, such a hard word to say, cerebrospinal fluid can wash out metabolic waste. Cerebrospinal fluid can wash out metabolic waste. I actually have so much to say about this and so little time, so I'll spare you the philosophical spiral I could get into about this topic for now. I'll just say, in brackets, that I've painted a Schriftbild about a decade ago entitled Life is a Disease and Sleep is the Practice of Its Cure, which is pretty much the gist of my thoughts. Anyway, the point is, sleep actively removes toxins that build up in our brains while we are awake. It's a cleaning cycle we don't get to witness. Sleep is material. We usually talk about sleep like it's some floaty, transcendental, ephemeral thing. It isn't, at least not only. Sleep requires surfaces, a sofa, the floor, grass, a trusted lap, a rumbling train window, a chair that seems to have not been designed for human anatomy, but somehow still works when exhaustion takes over. Every sleeping position in this archive was engineered by the material conditions available at the time. The body negotiates with whatever is there. Sleep is a way that the material translates into embodied ergonomic improvisations, how matter choreographs the body. Tim Ingold would say that bodies and materials correspond, forming environments together through movement and rest. So every picture here is also an image of maintenance, of my brain taking out its own toxicity while I'm cocooned in a swaying hammock. Because I ask people to photograph me, the archive is relational. I've fallen asleep on people, against people, next to people, in front of people. I've fallen asleep on stage more than once. I even fell asleep during a classical concert dedicated to me. Sure, I was just a sleepy kid who was awake way past her bedtime, but there was a picture of me getting carried out of the concert hall by my mother. The newspaper made fun of me, which is entirely fair. Another time, at a concert in a club, the entire floor was thumping from the crowd moving to the music. So, as you do, little me climbed up on stage to better observe the dancing adults and promptly fell asleep next to a booming speaker. I woke up backstage because, of course. But this is what I mean by relational. My sleep has a social life in that it is overtly trusting. I think that this is why some people find these photos uncomfortably vulnerable. But I'm not vain about my naps. I don't see these strangers, nor will I ever see them again, or be aware of them, so why should I care about the perception of my natural existence? It's just anatomy, the slack jaw, the limp hand, my spine doing its best impression of an abstract sculpture. Susan Sontag wrote that to photograph someone sleeping is to witness them without defenses, revealing the body in its most uncurated state. Bruno Latour's actor network theory would probably look at my sleeping scenes and treat everything, including my body, the camera, the chair, the floor, the people nearby, as part of one shared network, each element subtly acting on the others. It's an interesting way to think about it, but it can feel a bit like adding my unconscious body to a spreadsheet of influences. During the Thinking Further to Materiality lecture series, Joseph Dumit offered something that felt gentler, a method he called SAM, Substance as Method. Instead of tracing every actor an action like ANT does, SAM pays attention to how substances, such as images, materials, gestures, quietly reshape how we think and feel. I like that better for this project. These sleep photographs don't form a network of actions. They act more like a substance that slowly reorganizes my understanding of vulnerability, care, and presence. Being the rebel to social expectations that I like to think I am, I proudly sleep anywhere. I've slept in libraries, on grassy graveyard meadows between classes, on bus stops, sidewalks in the holiday heat, leaning against trees while waiting for meetings, sometimes standing up on trains, sometimes with an open book on my face, and often in the middle of a chore. Sleep is the most honest record the body keeps. No posing, no intention, no performance, just gravity, fabric, trust, light, exhaustion, and repair. Alvar Noé would call this a form of an active presence, where the body asserts its truth regardless of intention. Michael Foucault would likely recognize in these norms a form of biopolitical management, bodies timed, regulated, and optimized according to what counts as productive life in that culture. So what does your culture's attitude towards sleep say about its attitude towards capitalistic productivity and the role humans as living organisms fit into it? Because in most countries I've lived in, sleep is treated like a scheduling flaw, as if unconsciousness were a personal failure, as if taking time to remove cognitive waste was a waste of time. I used to think like this too. I'll get to that in a moment. Richard Sennett, writing about public and private life, might see these scenes as small acts that blur the boundaries between what is supposed to be visible and what should remain behind closed doors. My body trusts its own timing more than I trust clocks. As announced just now, not above because it's a video to you, even though it's above in the text to me while I'm writing the script, I think it's important that I bring up the time when my attitude was quite the opposite. For over a decade of my life, I actively resisted sleep. Byung-Chul Han has written extensively about how self-exploitation masquerades as achievement under neoliberal pressure. There were phases when I stayed awake for days at a time. I was hyper-focused, dissociated, floating slightly above myself. You get a lot done that way. Believe me, until you don't. believe me. It may seem impressively prolific from the outside, but it was actually a covert way to self-harm disguised as productivity. Eventually, when my wife and I moved in together, she insisted I sleep every day, eat every day, insisted that I function like a living organism instead of a haunted cyborg. At first, I resented the wasted time, but I also reluctantly understood that it was a beneficial practice in the long run. To trick myself into falling asleep without resentment, I trained myself to remember dreams. It made sleep feel productive, useful. This developed skill generated raw material from which I could then develop short stories and ideas. These photographs create a similar effect. The record of the unconscious becomes a long-term collaboration between my sleeping body and whoever happened to be near it, usually my sister, my wife, my mother, and sometimes a friend, resulting in a topic of thought, an archive of making the invisible tangible, something that is a thing unto itself. It's productive. But I need to stress that I don't mean productive in a capitalist way. I don't mean it in the way contemporary life has a deeply ambivalent relationship to sleep. Jonathan Crary identified it as both necessary and inconvenient to capitalist time. To me, at that time of my life, sleep was productive in a distinctively creative way. I like to think that Tim Ingold would have agreed, because he wrote about how creativity often emerges not from control, but from attunement to processes already unfolding. This is an archive of the life I never saw, the quiet shape of time I skip by being unconscious and regain with the images by others. This concept I have curated into a new form of time. There's a loop on the chain of perception of absence that you've now become a part of. Derrida will call this a trace, a presence marked by absence, a sign of what was never fully accessible. And yes, I promise, I generally do more than sleep. It's just that some of my sleeping is documented well enough, apparently, to become their own small theory of being alive. Thank you.